In this video, I'll demonstrate how you can use conditional functions in Excel to automatically remove outliers from your CurveFit with the MyCurveFit Excel Add-In. I have open an Excel spreadsheet with my data set including 8 calibrators, each run in replicates of 3. I've gone ahead and calculated my 4PL parameters, and I've created a chart displaying my fit and calibrators with all data included, using the X and Y data in these 2 columns. I'm going to create a new data set in the Y prime column, excluding my outliers, and use the X and Y prime data in these 2 columns to calculate the 4PL parameters and chart with the outlier excluded data. For automatic outlier removal, I need to establish a threshold or rule for what constitutes an outlier. In this case, I'll use the %CV. The %CV is calculated as the standard deviation of the replicates divided by the average of the replicates multiplied by 100 and provides information on the precision of the calibrator. The higher the %CV, the lower the precision. I've also added some conditional formatting to the %CV column to highlight cells greater than the specified threshold in red. I've currently set the %CV threshold to 25%. And if we quickly calculate that %CV, we can see that calibrator 1 has a %CV of 34. To create my Y prime data, I'll use a conditional if statement to exclude the Y values if the %CV is greater than the threshold. So I'll enter equals if, followed by our condition. If the %CV in C4 is less than the specified threshold in C1, and I'll press F4 to denote this as an absolute reference. Next, we need to enter the value if true, which will be the corresponding Y value from the Y column. And if the condition is false, then the value to enter will just be quotations for an empty cell. So this function says if the %CV is less than the threshold, report the Y column value. If it's greater than the threshold, report an empty cell. So now I'll just copy and paste this formula in for the remainder of our Y prime column. So now you can see calibrator 1 has been removed from the Y prime column because the %CV is greater than the defined threshold of 25. If we update this threshold to 15, you'll notice that calibrator 5 is also removed from the analysis as the %CV is greater than 15. Now I've already created an additional chart for my outlier remove data, so I just need to calculate the curve fit parameters with our new data to populate the chart. So I'll highlight the cells designated to house my parameters, enter equals MyCurveFit, and select the 4PL option. I'll highlight my calibrator X values and the new Y prime values and apply the function. Now looking at our charts, you can see calibrators 1 and 5 have been removed from analysis. Next, let's take a look at a slightly more complex method. This is the same data set. However, instead of removing the entire calibrator when the %CV is higher than the specified threshold, I'd like to remove the replicate furthest from the mean. Note that to automatically remove a replicate furthest from the mean, at least 3 replicates must be included for each calibrator. So you'll see we have some additional columns here added to our table. We have our original X and Y and the %CV calculated, with the %CV threshold set at the top of the sheet. Now, how do we determine which replicate should be removed if the %CV is unacceptable? First, we'll calculate the average, and then the absolute difference between the replicate and the average. Then we'll report the maximum of the differences, which will be the replicate that is furthest from the average. So let's go ahead and fill out these columns before we populate our Y prime column. In the average column, I'll enter equals average and highlight the replicates for our first calibrator. I'll copy and paste that down to fill the column. Next, I'll calculate the absolute difference. I'll do this by entering equals ABS for the absolute value of the average minus the corresponding Y value. I'll again copy and paste this down to fill the column. Next, I'll identify the maximum difference by entering equals max and selecting the differences for the first calibrator, and copy and paste to fill the column. Now let's discuss the y prime column. I'm going to use a nested conditional if statement because there are two things that will determine what value should be reported here. The first being whether or not the %CV is deemed acceptable, and the second is whether or not the corresponding value in the y column is the furthest from the mean. So I'll enter equals if and begin defining my first condition. If the %CV in C3 is greater than the threshold defined in C1, again pressing F4 to denote an absolute reference, then we'll need to exclude a replicate, which is where my second if statement will be added. So I'll enter if and select F3, which houses the maximum difference, is equal to the difference reported in the difference column. So if this is true, then the replicate should be excluded. So I'll enter quotations like we used in the previous example to report an empty cell. However, if this is not true, I'd like to report the corresponding value in the y column. This closes out the interior statement. So I'll close my parentheses and go back to the original if statement. So if the %CV is not over the defined threshold, I'd also like to report the value in the y column, which completes my original if statement, and I'll again close the parentheses. Once we press enter, you can see here that the first replicate is excluded, and that's because this is the replicate furthest from the mean for a calibrator with an unacceptable %CV. Now I'll copy and paste this down to fill the remainder of the column. Let's recalculate the %CV to see the difference between the outlier included and excluded. So again, that's standard deviation of our replicates divided by the average times 100. And you can see the %CVs are greatly improved for the calibrators with the replicates removed. I've also created two charts for this example, one showing all data included and the other showing outliers removed, and you can see the fit is improved. You can download a copy of this example spreadsheet from the below link if you'd like to review its configuration. If you have any questions about how to automatically remove outliers from your data set using the MyCurveFit Excel Add-In, please email us at support@myassays.com.